Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so thanks everybody for attending, for joining us. We decided when we were looking to run something on working in the new environment, we didn't want to sort of just talk about the obvious stuff that everybody's talking about at the moment, which is how do you remote working and using that technology. I think we're 3 weeks into this unfortunate situation we find ourselves in, and I think everybody's really starting to find their way in terms of working from home and operating businesses with a distributed workforce. So we thought we'd just take a slightly different slant on this and look at it from a strategic point of view, and how can you adapt your business and your business strategy to work in what is an uncertain world, to say the least, at the moment. And a lot of organizations are, I wouldn't say, well, there are some organizations who are struggling to adapt, but there's a lot of organizations wondering how to continue to feel their way forward in real time. And the world of having sort of fixed business strategies and fixed business plans, I think, is a thing of the past now. It's the world's just too uncertain, and what we're trying to do today is just sort of share some thoughts on what an agile approach to running your business is in real time. So that's what we've decided to do. Okay, slide changing. Okay, so just who I am. So I'm Alistair MacLeod. I run a company called Grey Fox Consulting, working in partnership with Winning Moves. I've got 28 years experience in both business and technology. I was a director of a large consultancy company. We scaled that business up to 200 people, and we had 3 UK locations. And just before I left that business, we were opening up an office in Australia. So I've been through the process of going from a small company to a fairly large company, and all of the challenges that come with that. And I worked with that company for over 20 years, and I saw that company go through a couple of recessions as well, and certainly the crash of 2008, which was interesting times. And so I've got some experience of how to adapt and change to the new world. I also have 2 businesses myself. I'm Grey Fox Consulting. I'm also involved in another business, a technology startup business, which is they're developing an app for skills-based passports in the construction sector. My background is actually software engineering. I started off as a software developer, but moved into doing digital consultancy, and I've worked in digital consultancy for over 20 years across a broad range of sectors. So just to give you some background as to why you might think I'm an authority to talk about this stuff. So let's just put some context around this. I wanted to just put some sort of principles down on paper first before we get into this. Business strategy and your strategy is unique to you. What I'm not going to tell you today is what your strategy should be. It's unique to every organization. The strategy is the activities that you decide to undertake in order to meet your own objectives. It is about focus and action. There's a lot of discussion around strategy actually when you look online, and a lot of organizations think strategy is objectives and think strategy is vision and mission statements. They have these kind of poster strategies, and that's not true. It's fine having a vision and a mission for your business and a set of values, but actually strategy is about getting into the detail of how you make all of that happen and being focused and having priorities. What we're going to show you today is just show you a framework that helps you build a resilient and agile strategy, as I said, so you can tackle things in real time. This approach doesn't undermine the principles, having good business foundations, and we're going to talk about some of that as well, having the solid business foundations to build on, and then having the agility wrapped around that. And I think the other thing is bad strategy is still a bad strategy. If the strategy, if the strategy you decide to adopt is a bad strategy, it will still be a bad strategy no matter what framework or approach that you take to it. So just some principles to bear in mind as we go through the conversation. I just put this quote in here, and I think the one thing I've sort of the only problem I've got with this quote is hope for tomorrow. I'm a big believer that hope is not a strategy, and yet you've actually got to build out a strategy. But I put this quote in here because I think it's just poignant in the times that we live in at the moment, where we've got to live for today in the sense that we've got to be constantly changing our approach to our businesses on a daily basis. And we've got to be learning from the lessons of the past, and we've got to be horizon scanning into the future, and hoping that we can actually get through this. And the point of having a framework like what I'm going to describe is to equip you with the tools to do so. So I just wanted to start off by talking about the traditional approach to strategy, and how businesses tend to tackle strategy. And again, I've been through this process myself, and I've seen how rigid this approach can be and how slow you can be to adapt. It gets more difficult as your business scales, actually. So as you get bigger as an organization, it gets harder to actually be more agile, because you tend to get bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy. But you know, you've got to be mindful of that all the time, and you've got to be looking to readjust just what you're doing. So in terms of what the traditional approach looks like, so hopefully this diagram makes sense to you. What people tend to do is they tend to sit in a room and they say, okay, let's build out our mission, vision and objectives, and let's do some external analysis on the marketplace. You know, how do we position ourselves uniquely in the marketplace that we're operating in? How do we differentiate ourselves from everybody else, and why would a customer come and use us? And then you get into the detail of sort of building out doing a sort of SWOT analysis on that sort of set of objectives that you've got, and saying, well, okay, what's our strengths, weaknesses as a company, and what opportunities and threats do we have from an external point of view? And you can build that into a strategy map. People have come across the strategy map concept before. It was Kaplan and Norton. Again, it's a tool that I've used quite a lot. Don't use it so much now because it's a bit too rigid. But the strategy map allows you to lay out your financial goals, how you want to be perceived by your customers, your internal structure. So what does your business need to look like from a sort of internal organizational point of view, and what your people strategy is. And then you can also use the business model. There's the business model canvas. I don't know if people have used that tool before. You can build out a business model from your strategy map to say, okay, this is the customer segments we're targeting, and these are the value propositions that we're going to develop out, the value proposition bundles. What does our capability look like, and what activities do we need to do, and which of those activities can we do, or do we need to use a supply chain to actually provide some of that with? So those tools are commonplace, and you can build out a balanced scorecard from that as well to come up with all your metrics, and you can sort of lay all that out. And then the strategy piece really is then taking all of those elements and saying, what is it we need to do to make this happen? And that's really where the strategy bit comes in, and that's really about building that out. Now, and you use the people in your organization to do that, and you have the governance model wrapped around that, you know, your traditional board of directors and your executive team, and then you have your middle management who are in charge of their individual departments and their individual silos. So that's the approach people take. I'm not saying any of this is wrong, by the way. These things are still relevant, and this thinking still needs to happen. And later on in the presentation, you'll see that. But I'm just saying this is the typical approach that people use. And then in terms of the strategy governance, well, it's your classic top-down. You tend to see, you know, you have your executive team at the top, who's your board of directors, and your senior managers who are responsible for governance and looking at risk and doing decision-making. And then that decision-making gets pushed down the organization into middle management. And then you have your departments who are focused on the customers. You know, they're the front-end sort of line of business departments, technical delivery of the products and the services. And then the way you would execute that is you would say, okay, well, we tend to look at assess the current internal and external factors, you know, look at the risks. We pull that into a strategic set of risks, which might identify what preventing us from succeeding. So the SWOT analysis that I talked about before. And then we build out up to a 3-year strategy. Some companies go out 5 years. You know, to say, well, what does the company want to look like in 5 years' time, and where are we headed with? And then you get on with implementing that. And then typically what you do is you have a 12-month business planning meeting every 12 months or so to say how we're doing against the strategic goals and aims. Okay, so that's typically what I've seen, and I've worked under that kind of model myself. The problem with that model is objectives of the business are built around the current state and a predetermined future state. And what I mean by that is you tend to say, well, where are we now, and what is it, where do we want to get to? And you build out a roadmap based on that. So you say, well, this is where we are in 3 years' time. This is where we want to be. How do we get down that route? And let's go for it. So it's fixed in the sense that it's very linear in terms of its approach. the implementation of this model and its efficiency becomes the primary focus of the business. And what I mean by that is you tend to then become obsessed with making that map that you've developed happen. And it's all about trying to make that as efficient as possible. So you start building out your strategy around the efficiency of making that model that you've come up with work. And as a result, strategies tend to become limited to the near future, and because the business becomes what I call an organization-focused organization. Again, I've actually had firsthand of this, where you just spend endless days in meetings talking about problems that you've got with your business and not really talking about the customers and the value that you should be creating for your customers. And all of your focus and attention becomes focused on the internal problems that you have as an organization. And it's very difficult once you get into that mindset to start stepping outside of that and thinking about actually what's impacting the business now, what external factors are impacting our business, and what is it we need to do about that. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that resonates with people. And from the governance model point of view, it's very top down. I've mentioned that already, and it can become a bit of a bureaucratic process and a bit of a drag, because information has to come down the chain, and it has to go back up to the chain for decisions to be made. So there's a lot of escalation and of problems, and you know, in some organisations, and I've seen this, the board of directors, you know, tend to get involved in making, you know, decisions on who the cleaning company should be, you know, and it really just is a complete waste of time. And the other problem with this as well is, if you're going to have that model where information needs to be sort of going backwards and forwards all the time, it relies on a lot of analysis, collection, and presentation of that information just to justify your tactics and gain approval. So in those bureaucratic environments, people spend endless days justifying their decisions and pulling together information that actually justifies that, rather than just kind of getting on with it. And then the final bit is the sort of departments operating silos, creating further inward focus. Mentioned that already. You tend to get a bit of a warlord structure appearing, where everybody's protecting their own interests and become very siloed off. So these are things that I've seen with. I'm not saying that's always the case, but you know, I've seen examples of that many times in the work that I've done, and certainly I've been guilty of it myself, you know, of behaving in this way sometimes. And then finally, the bit with the sort of execution of the strategy as well. I've mentioned this already. You go through cycles, tend to be very slow. Strategies only reviewed annually, and the rest of the year is focused on executing the plan that you've come up with. So very linear in its approach. Unfortunately, as we well know, I don't really want to mention the dreaded word coronavirus, but you know, it's hard not to. We live in a very uncertain world, and I think this current situation we find ourselves is pretty unprecedented. But actually, there's a well-known sort of saying that, you know, risks will happen. You know, risks that you don't think will happen will eventually happen, given enough time. And there's a great example of that, of the Metropolitan Police. I was in a discussion with a lady who was their digital leader. Actually, she was the head of IT in the Met Police, and she was talking about how they had on their risk log that because they were the Met Police, they would that funding would never stop, you know, because the Met Police is the most important police force in the country, and they would always be funded. And then obviously austerity came around, and before they knew it, they were being asked to shave 20% off their police budget. And whilst they had that on their risk log, it was very low likelihood, and they didn't take it seriously. They didn't scenario plan for that situation, so they didn't have that kind of preparedness for that risk becoming a real issue. So you know, I think we've got to be realistic. I mean, I'm not saying, you know, we need to be doom and gloom and go around worrying about you know, the end of the world, but you know, we do need to be realistic about the chances of these things happening. And you know, one of the risks that isn't on there at the moment, I don't think I've put it, is in uncertain world, is things like environmental risks. You know, well, the chances are in 5-10 years time, we might start to see a real impact on environmental issues if we continue the way we are. So those kind of things need to be considered. So I've put this slide on here. I wanted to talk about the impact of that uncertainty. I'm hoping that's animating for everybody, and you can see this working through. I'm going to talk about one of the companies in a minute that are on this, but what this is showing you is the brand ranking in terms of brand value, so the total value of those companies over a period of time. So you can see it's going through the years on the bottom, and the company's brand value is increasing. Now, clearly all of these companies are in different sectors, so they're not competing against each other. But what it's showing you is, as you can see, Google's starting to move up the chain there when we're getting to 2010. Microsoft is still pretty strong in terms of their overall brand value there. IBM are as well. But look at Apple. Apple go racing away there and all the way up to the top. And then I think Amazon come in as well at some point. There they are there. They come in. And I think what it's shown, and Nokia now have completely disappeared off the list, as you can see. They were up at the top and they've just gone. And it's Nokia that I want to talk about actually in terms of this slide. I just want to show this because I think this slide is quite powerful in terms of showing there are a number of organizations on this slide who actually are quite sustainable, who still stay in the top 10, BMW and Disney being the two that really stand out for me in terms of that sustainability piece. They've managed to keep themselves in that top 15. But Apple came from nowhere and raced away. I'm going to talk about Apple a bit later on in the presentation. But if we look at Nokia are the ones which really resonated with me on that slide, which would sort of, sorry about this slide being slightly text heavy, but Nokia were the ones that really resonated. They were the ones where they just kind of fell off quite quickly. And, you know, we all know the story of Nokia. We all had Nokias in our pockets in the sort of 90s and in the 2000s. And Apple just came along and completely changed the face of the phone market, really, by introducing the smartphone. But Nokia were in such a strong position. I mean, you know, their market value declined 90% in 6 years. They were in such a strong position. How did that happen? And there were some issues around culture in Nokia. I mean, they had temperamental leaders, and they sort of ruled with an iron fist, I think. But going back to that example of being an focused organization, they were focused on meeting quarterly targets, and they were afraid of the external environment. They were afraid of kind of looking outside at what was going on. They were just so focused on keep churning the revenue wheel and keep meeting those targets, because there was that kind of rule of sort of, you must meet these targets, and you know these need to be met, and if you don't, you know, there'll be consequences for that. They started to lose sight of innovation, and they started to lose sight of what was going on in the market, and it was all just driven to short-term market demands. And as a result, they completely lost their way. I mean, there was some issues with their sort of technology as well. But again, that was because they started putting in place a management structure of people who didn't actually understand the technology and the customer value that was being created. They didn't have engineers, or people had come from an engineering background in the management team. They had managers, and they didn't understand the sort of the flaws with the product. So it's an example of how quickly you can fall, I suppose, if you're too focused on yourself and your strategy is too rigid. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So rethinking strategy. So how can we sort of adopt a more agile approach to this? I love this quote. It's more to do with you know, saying, you know, if you're just sitting there waiting for things to change, then you'll be wasting your time, because there'll be somebody coming up behind you who's learned how to climb the tree and go and get the mangoes for themselves. So it's just a great analogy in saying, don't stand still. You know, you need to think differently about how you can actually tackle the problems that are in front of you. And so this slide here is just trying to describe the difference between you know, agility and stability. So having a stable strategy, the traditional approach that I talked about, you know, has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages. So it can be very efficient and it can be very reliable. You know, you can drive a lot of efficiency into your business in terms of how you do things, but you get dragged down by the decision-making process and the lack of information and the bureaucratic control that I talked about earlier. Conversely to that, though, having too much agility as well can be a problem. It can, you know, it can encourage a culture of taking too many risks. You can get a lack of quality control. The biggest thing you see, and I have actually, when was talking about the business I worked in, we scaled that business up. We went through this pendulum swing all the time. And you try and loosen control a bit to try and sort of get things moving, but then you'd very quickly see some of these issues around agility emerge, which was a silo mentality, reinventing the wheel. I would find out that people were coming up with proposals for service offerings that we had been doing for years, and that information knowledge had kind of been lost somehow, and people were just spending their time sort of reinventing all of that stuff. So you've got to be careful about getting a balance between having some stable foundations that provide really good governance around what you're doing as a business, and but also against looking outside of the window and having a look what's going on in the world outside, and being able to actually adjust your course of action in real time to meet those needs, which Nokia didn't do. Nokia failed to do that. Okay, so the approach we're going to try and describe hopefully gives you the tools to sort of start thinking about that. I wanted to pull an analogy. Forgive me if you can't really see this. It's a bit the color scheme. I should have probably changed this color scheme, but I wanted to give you an analogy of something that's agile and stable at the same time. And the only thing I could think of was a computer. We're all sitting here on our computers now, actually, and a computer is something that's very stable. And the hardware that the computer has is very, very stable. It's been tested in labs. It works. The screens just work. The keyboards just work. We can connect to the internet, so the wireless components work. And we know they're just going to be reliable, and we're going to get at least 5 years worth of life out of those. So we know that's going to be very reliable. Even the operating system that the computer is built on, the kernel, it's called the kernel, is very reliable. That's the operating system that you then run all the applications on. The agility piece comes through the apps and the software. And what you can do is you can bend and change this computer to do lots of different things. We're all sitting using it as a video conferencing suite right now. I've produced this PowerPoint presentation on it, and I can go and play a game on it later on if I wanted to. I could watch Netflix later on if I wanted to on my computer as well. So that agility piece it can change and adapt very quickly, and you can write new products, and new products come onto market, but the underlying hardware and operating system is very stable, and that's the kind of governance piece around making sure that computer works properly. So that's what we kind of mean. It's a bit of a loose analogy, but you get the point. So I've called this the strategy kernel. So the kernel in a computer language is the operating system. It's the bit that makes the interface between the hardware and the software just work. So I thought, well, this is kind of the strategy kernel for me. This is the bit that needs to be reliable. This is the bit that needs to be completely solid foundations of any agile strategy. And I've kind of broken this down into four different areas. You have your kind of mission statements. So, being clear in your own minds as to what the character and purpose of your organization is about is absolutely important, and making sure that you communicate that effectively to the rest of the organization and to your customers is absolutely important as well. So and I'll come on to how our tools I've used in the past in order to do that. Having really good governance is important. Now, governance is an interesting one because that's where that pendulum swing comes in. People often think governance means bureaucracy, but it doesn't. And governance is the evil to having a culture of trust and empowerment. Again, it doesn't. You can trust and empower people to do things, but you can put good governance in place, which provides boundaries for people to operate in. So if they, and providing clarity of what those boundaries are is absolutely key. And then the structure is how you structure your organization. Now, this is an interesting one because, and I'll come on to this in a moment, but traditional structures are very sort of, manager, team leader, team, and they have limitations, which I'll come on to. And the alternative of that is to have a matrix-based structure, and there are issues with having a matrix-based structure in terms of having lots of contradictions going on in the organization and having a lot of consensus kind of politics going on. So again, you've got to try and find that balance between the two. And then the processes. Processes is an interesting one as well. in an agile, with an agile strategy, what you need to do is be able to adapt your processes to meet current demands. But you do need to have some core processes that are the kind of stable, efficient backbone. So, for example, Amazon have a very they have a very strong backbone of their supply chain. So their supply chain is pretty much cemented in. Car manufacturers are the same, but they will be agile. So car manufacturers are constantly changing the design of their cars to incorporate new technology to meet the demands of the world. I mean, electric cars are now becoming mainstream. Driverless cars will probably come on, but actually that supply chain and those core processes are very solid, very efficient, standardized, and then integrated into their business. So that's what we mean by having that kind of core functional backbone. Just to sort of talk in a bit more detail about some of these principles, the character and purpose. This is a sort of derived from I don't know if anybody's read the book Good to Great from Jim Collins. It's the Hedgehog Principles. It's called the Hedgehog Principles, and it's basically meaning, you know, I'll not go into the full backstory because we haven't got the time, but the Hedgehog Principles are what is it you as an organization are strong at, and we use this in my previous role just as a really simple way of laying down what we were passionate about, what you wanted to be the best at, and what did we value the most. So what are our values? So, you know, we wanted to be passionate about helping clients achieve their business objectives using digital technology and a different way of thinking. You know, what do we want to be the best at? We want to be the best at delivering high quality value outcomes for clients, you know. So it was, you know, it was being seen to be a trusted advisor for the clients and being seen to deliver that value. And then what do you value the most is we value looking after people, both the clients and our own people. And we valued about having customer focused driven outcomes for our clients, et cetera, et cetera. So though you can get those things down on paper. And this is a really great, if you want to look at this in more detail, it's called the Hedgehog Principles. The purpose behind it is, it's the fox and the hedgehog. So a fox has many strategies for trying to survive, but a hedgehog only has one, and that's to curl itself up in a ball. And the Hedgehog Principles is, you know, you focus on your core sort of purpose, and that's what you should try and hang everything else around. It's in the book Good to Great. It's a good read if you've never done it, if you've never read it. This is again, this is a really good tool we use. I've pulled this into here because when I come on to how you can actually pull your strategy around to be a bit more agile, it kind of resonates with these value disciplines. This is called the value discipline model. And again, this is a great way. In fact, I've used this tool many a time in conversations with boards of directors in terms of how they perceive themselves as an organization. So the model has three sort of core principles. It's every organization has these three drivers, but one of these drivers will be the dominant one. So the drivers are being product leader, so developing out best products. You know, that's basically the innovation piece. Operationally excellent, which is the efficiency piece, and customer intimate, which has been developing out solutions that are unique to the customer, so bespoke solutions. And like I say, most organizations have elements of all three, but one will be dominant. So an example of a customer intimate organization would be a consultancy company who would come in and look at your problems and then come up with recommendations and come up with solutions that are pretty unique to you. Or bespoke software, for example. You know, if you can't get something off the shelf, software developers would come in and map out all of your requirements and then build you something bespoke. That's a customer intimate solution. That's a customer intimate organization. And the emphasis there is on having long-term sustainable relationships with your customers, and getting to know your customers really, really well in a lot of detail and understanding their pains really well. Operationally excellence typically tend to be the car manufacturers I talked about. So it's all about driving that kind of reliable product, low cost, high quality. So low cost to the organization to build, high quality to the consumer, fixed production, fairly fixed production, and efficiency is dominant. So we all know about the Toyota way and the principles of what they introduced in the sort of 80s and 70s. And then best product is product innovation. So an example of a product leader would be somebody like Apple. Again, I'm going to use Apple because I've got them as an example later on. They're product leader. They're constantly innovating products, and they're constantly trying to reinvent new ways of providing consumer value. interestingly, if you look on the back of an iPhone, it's a good example of this. If you look on the back of an iPhone, it says something like designed in California and manufactured in China, because Apple don't do the production of the iPhones. They outsource that to an operationally excellent company who manufactures the iPhones. So you can actually use this model to understand where partnerships might be best suited, rather than Apple are not interested in producing the actual iPhones themselves. You know, that's a very different business model to the one that they're pursuing. They're interested in innovating and coming up with new ideas. But as I said, as an organization, you can have elements of all three of these. And actually, when we come on to how you might look at being more agile in the future, you can pull yourself around these three kind of components to actually to move your strategy around. But I'll come on to that in a bit. Moving on to governance. Governance is an interesting one. It's as I said before, it's about clarity of decision making and the boundaries that are around that. So boundaries mean, you know, boundaries are linked to what your appetite for risk is as an organization, as a business, you know, and then what boundaries you put around that. Where possible, you need to delegate as much authority to the front line as possible. But you have to have those boundaries around that, and you have to have accountability for those decisions. So trust and empowerment doesn't mean that you can go off and do whatever you want. Trust and empowerment means you're empowered to actually make decisions on a day-to-day basis within the boundaries, and you are accountable for those decisions. So an example of that is I did a lot of work in social. I still do a lot of work in social housing, and they have what's called housing officers who work with their tenants, and the housing officers are kind of the social care side of the business. They're there to work with the tenants to make sure that tenants who are from a sort of vulnerable position will look after the asset, the house, and will also be able to pay the rent. So that they put a lot of emphasis on that. And what used to happen is if a housing officer had to spend money, they used to have to fill in a form and get that form approved back at the office. What they've done is they've empowered the housing officers to actually be able to spend money on behalf of the tenants, up to a certain limit, up to a certain boundary. So it's crazy, actually. Some of the examples that I've heard is things like housing officers buying tenants' children a pair of shoes, because the pair of shoes means that the kid goes to school. It means that the parents are less stressed and won't turn to drugs again or whatever it might be. And that means that they're more likely to continue to be a sustainable tenant and look after the assets. So little interventions like that can mean a lot in that world. And before it was very bureaucratic. Now the housing officers within the boundaries can actually go and do that. It's a simple example, but it shows you how trust and empowerment can work effectively within certain boundaries. Consensus decisions are the ones that require cross-functional operation. So this is where your decision-making meetings need to be. This is where you need to actually have your committees, if you want to call them that. I hate that word myself, but and far too many organizations have organizational charts that have that then have meetings attached to every point on that organizational chart, and everybody just meets, and what they turn into is just an exchange of information, and no decisions are really made from that. What you need to do is say the second level of governance in our business is this consensus. These are the areas where we require people to come together to make a decision across the business. So you're not in your own delegated area, you're across the functions, and you should have a meeting, but you should have that with a clear chart of action. I know it's hard to do that. It's really hard to do, because people tend to come along with big PowerPoint presentations like I'm presenting today and start to tell you how great their part of their business is. But it's a really hard thing to get right, that. But that's how it should be. And then finally, your executive decisions. The board of directors and the executive team, which is the senior management team, they should only be making decisions on either large investment requirements or areas where there's an increase of risk to the business somehow. So it's that overall governance piece, and decisions that they need to make need to be of that size and magnitude, not, you know, which cleaning company should we employ, or you know, can such and such buy their tenant a pair of shoes for their child, you know. That needs to be left to the people on the ground day to day. I hope that makes sense. And then the key thing about your governance model is making sure that everybody in the organization understands it, and are clear about both their accountability but also the authority that they have. Okay, and from a risk point of view, you could very quickly get into trouble if people don't understand that. You know, you might think it's okay to allow people to just go and spend money, you know, up to a certain limit. You know, okay, we'll just let everybody spend £1,000. But if your business starts to scale and you've got 200 people working in that, you could very quickly start spending £200,000 every year, every month rather, on £20,000 every month on nothing, you know, because people have got that level of authority. So you need to have the appetite for risk wrapped around this kind of governance boundary. And then the final bit on governance is having metrics that align to your objectives. Again, I'm not going to go into talking about metrics too much today, because that's a whole topic in its own right. But I just wanted to make a couple of points on this, which is, you know, think about metrics which are actually aligned to the value that you create and have them correlated on performance. What I see a lot of is organizations measuring their financial performance and then assuming because their financial performance is good that the business must be doing okay. But actually you can still have good financial performance, but you might actually not be creating the value that you set out to create. So you might actually be behaving in a particular way with your customers that doesn't create the value that you wanted to, or the correlation between the financial performance might be skewed by one particular event. What I'm saying here is that what you need to do is understand how value is created in your organization to your customers, measure that, and then correlate that with the outputs, the outcomes that the business has seen in terms of the financial performance. And then you can use that information to determine where risks or issues are in your business. I could do a whole seminar on this, but we're not here to talk about that today. But it's just something to go in, have a think about. Are you comfortable that your KPIs in terms of your governance model are actually measuring the value that's created in your business, and have you got sight of that? And then going on to structure, the structure of the organization. This is the sort of the two-tiered structure, but actually what I've done here is put a three-tiered structure in. It's an interesting model, this, and I'm a big fan of it because for various reasons. I think in traditional organizations, what you tend to see is, as I said, you have your directors and your executive team, then you have your managers, then you have your team leaders, then you have your technical people, and technical people tend to get promoted into a team leader role, and then onto the route to sort of successes through the team leader role, through the manager role, and onto the board. And that's not always a good thing. Technical people, not all technical people make good team leaders. So that shouldn't be the only route for people. And I think you need to disconnect where you get developed. So I've said where you develop the formal organizational chart, where you receive personal development coaching. People do need a home. People need somewhere to go to and have somebody they can go and report to. But that might be different to where they work and where they do their day-to-day activities. And they might actually report to somebody slightly differently on a day-to-day basis, but still have their team leader. And then where you learn is where you build up your knowledge and skills. So in a previous role that I had, I was in a consultancy company. This is going back nearly 20 years now, but this model worked really well. I was based in the Newcastle office, and I had a team leader who I reported to, and he looked after me. He had my back. He had my personal development. He was the person who did my reviews. He was the person I could go to if I had any personal problems. But I would be often seconded onto projects in different parts of the country. And I on a day-to-day basis, I reported to the project manager, the project lead, or the project director on that project, and they had my back from a sort of day-to-day point of view. Making sure that I was okay in the hotel I was staying in, and making sure that I knew what I was doing, etc., etc. But then within that company, we had what was called communities of practice, where we learned. So I could be a member of many communities of practice, or I could run a community of practice myself, and it would be just a place where we could share and innovate. And I think having this kind of structure is quite an interesting model to adopt, because it frees the organization up from the kind of rigid structures, but it still gives people a home and a sense of being, but it also gives people the opportunity to actually develop in different ways. And I wanted to put this one on here as well, particularly at the SME level, so the smaller SME side of things. When you're looking across your organization in terms of responsibilities, because I'm a big fan of talking in terms of responsibilities rather than specific roles, you've just got to make sure that you have a balance. These four roles are critical to your success of your business, and being being a balanced business means that you've got the right balance between these roles. What you tend to see with startups is you tend to see startups are being run by somebody who's technical, who wanted to start up the business because they wanted to get rid of the boss and they wanted to just do their own work. But they might not necessarily have been an entrepreneur, or you might get somebody who's very entrepreneurial but is not very good on the technical side of things. And to build up the foundations of a good business, you need to have a balance of all of these roles. So your technical role is the person who delivers the services or the products. Your managers are the people who manage the business administration side of things and the delivery of the work. Your talent management are people who look after the people and attract the right people. And your entrepreneurs are the people who goes out there and looks for new opportunities and brings the work in for the technical people to deliver and the managers to manage. So you've got to get that balance of those people right. And in the current environment, what we're seeing is a lot of people are furloughing staff. And I've had some conversations with various customers about how they're actually approaching that. And there's different methods being used. And I suppose my only caution would be make sure you don't lose that balance of these roles, because they're really critical to the success of the business. You need to make sure that, yes, you can furlough people, but, you might end up furloughing all your entrepreneurs out of the business, in which case, how are you going to find new opportunities when we come out of this or while we're in this? Because people are still trying to do business. People are still trying to make things work. And then on structure, the sort of the T's and the I's, you might have seen this before. So are you a T-based person or an I-based person? So I was very much a T-based person in my last role. I knew it, and I understood the whole organization and the services that we provided, and I could talk to customers at length about a number of those services. But when it came to actually the delivery, I could talk to the customer about their problems, and I could talk about services that might solve those problems and things we could do. But when it came to actually doing the delivery, I needed to get the subject matter experts in the eyes who could actually get into the detail of delivering out the solution and delivering that value to the customer. I had my own I bit, and that's why I was a T. My specialism was around software and information systems and digital strategy. So I could get involved in projects related to that and deliver work, but I was a generalist in the sense that I understood a lot of stuff. I understood a lot about a lot of different things as well. And again, it's about getting the balance right. Don't have your business full of those I's, because it makes it very rigid. If you have your business with T's and I's, you've got a lot more agility, and your generalists can move around and be involved in different stuff. The process bit, I just wanted to flash this slide up. I talked quite a lot about the processes when we were going through it, hardening those sort of signature processes that you might have in your business. But I wanted to make sure that you understood that those signature processes really need to be driven out from your customer life cycle at the core. That's when you're looking at what your signature processes are, those processes that need to be both resilient, highly resilient, but also very efficient. It's a customer life cycle that you need to look at across all functions. And we'll talk a little bit about resiliency in a bit, but resiliency is really about cross-functional processes, not resiliency within individual departments. Cross-functional processes is how resilient you make your customer life cycle, and having all of the teams in the business looking at the things in blue are things that might happen. So risks, events, tensions within that sort of cycle, gaining insight into what's going on. And what you want is, from an empowered team, is to be able to analyze, respond, and improve. So everybody's kind of working on the business. I've got a saying which I use, which is, don't just work in your business, work on it as well. Make sure that you're constantly trying to improve your business. It's that continuous improvement piece, and making sure that everybody in the organization is working in the business and on the business at the same time, and looking across those kind of core processes. And this is kind of, and then building in that resiliency, which I talked about, those resilient processes. So once you've understood what those core kind of processes are, so the critical customer outcomes, be clear on the objectives and how value is created, be clear on those critical customer processes. So look across those cross-functional teams that I talked about, and then look at the critical people. So who are critical to making those processes work? And that's where your resiliency. So when we're talking about business, there's a lot of people I know talking about business resiliency at the moment. It's slightly, the horse has bolted slightly on that one a little bit, because we're all in recovery mode at the moment and rethinking our strategies. But the point of this is, if you want to be resilient, if you want to understand the risks you're going to carry to your business, and you want to understand scenarios that might occur and how that might impact your business, you've got to look at your core critical customer processes. I've seen, I was involved in a discussion last week where people were talking about, disaster recovery and business resiliency is often given to the IT department. And I kind of sort of interjected and said, well, this isn't just about IT, this is about the business as a whole. This is about how you keep your business functioning in the event of a problem. And this is where you use risk appraisal, where, how your risk profile to actually assess what's going on, and then you respond quickly to that. But you have your critical customer processes at the core. It's easy to try and develop a business continuity plan right across the organization. And I've seen business continuity plans that involve every department and involve every process, and you end up with hundreds of processes that need to be made resilient. But the chances are that if a big event occurred, actually all you're interested in is the continuation of service delivery to the customers, and things like marketing and HR and what have you can wait. Keeping the service to the customer or the product delivered to the customer is the critical process, and everything else can be deemed as sort of secondary to that. And yes, you should have business continuity for those things, but those things can come later down the line. It wouldn't all happen at once. So how do we manage these strategic tensions? So I'm just going to talk about this. So this is the model that we've got in terms of how do you manage this, and I've kind of laid it out in terms of three things. I see three things which kind of put tension on your strategy: your customers and your markets. So changing markets, i.e., you've got new competitors entering your marketplace. Your markets are changing for whatever reason. There might be pressure. I mean, we're all going to see tension on our markets, I think, when we come through this. And we're all going to have to think differently about our place in those markets. What your customer requirements are, customer changing requirements. Who is your customer segments, and do their requirements change? Do you need to have new customer segments, and the type of relationship you have with them? At the capability of your business. So how do you finding the right people and having people who are agile enough to move through your organization is key. And building out partnerships actually as well, understanding where you need to have a supply chain and where you need to have partnerships to build out that capability, and which capability do you want to do? I've often questioned customers who try and diversify too much, particularly around professional services. People try and build big legal departments and big IT departments when actually they'd be better off just using an outsourced partner, get more value. Might be slightly more expensive, but they'll get much more of a professional service from that. So it's looking at that kind of capability and where's those tension points are, and then also innovation. So how do we keep innovating and staying fresh? And that's the kind of ideas bit. So our current solutions, so innovating around current solutions that we've got, and services that sit with those solutions, and then what R&D can we do in terms of that horizon scanning in the future. So for me, those kind of three: customers, capability, innovation, are the things that kind of pull your business in different directions. And I'll talk about I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, and I'll give you a few examples. I've got a couple of case studies to show how this has actually worked in practice. But how do you actually, as a business, how do you sit there and think, okay, where do we need to put our focus? Because the whole point of this model is that you move yourself around this model to put the focus where it's required based on what's happening externally. And this is where your rethinking resiliency piece comes in. So resilience, looking at resiliency not as a reactive thing that needs to be about minimizing loss when a problem happens, but looking at resiliency as a strategic tool and part of your strategic agility. So you're constantly looking out the window, and you're constantly looking at things that might be putting tension on your organization, and you're focusing constantly on that value protection and that value creation. So you're taking that outside perspective all the time. Going back to what I said about the organization, focused organization, that danger of just looking inward on the problems that you've got as a business and not actually looking out the window and thinking, how is the world outside changing, and how is that impacting on what we are doing? This is a model. I just threw this in here, which it's a model I've used before. I just think it's a nice way of showing how you can think about it, thinking about in the round about resiliency. People often don't, there's a lot of work tends to be put into insight and oversight, But things like hindsight and foresight tend to be overlooked. It's particularly lessons learned. I mean, we're particularly bad at sort of managing lessons learned processes for some reason. I don't know why. It's just one of those things that never really gets the attention it deserves. You know, there's a great book which is around. It's called Checklists, I think, and it's around pilot checklists for flights, airline pilots, and the airline industry is really good at lessons learned, because you know they're under a lot of regulation, but also if something goes wrong on an aeroplane, a lot of people die, and they constantly. So there's a great TV show called Air Crash Investigation, and you can see the process that they go through to always trying to understand what went wrong, like into a lot of detail as to what exactly went wrong, replicating that, coming up with a bunch of lessons learned and how the whole airline industry needs to change. And you see airlines grounded, flights are grounded because planes have got certain faults in them and they need to be rectified. And then what happens is the pilots then get checklists. It gets built into their checklists. That's why pilots have checklists, to try and weed out those kind of human errors. So the airline industry is really good at sort of that kind of hindsight and that foresight bit, and really looking and learning lessons. The rest of the world seems to be particularly bad at it. People tend to do lessons learned, put them on a spreadsheet, and then bury them somewhere in the network folder, and nobody ever learns from it again. You know. But anyway, this book talks about how you can embed the right culture of lessons learned into your organization. I'm generalizing there, so sorry if anybody here is really good at lessons learned. I'm generalizing, but that's just based on my experience. In terms of risk awareness as well, so this is a tool you can use, and again, this is something that is particularly bad in small organizations. More corporate organizations like banks, which is who are regulated, they are really good at this, and regulated industries tend to be very good at risk appraisal and risk assessment. But most organizations do have some form of risk profiling, but they tend to be really bad at it. People don't actually understand what a risk is and what the things are you need to focus on, how you assess the impact against the appetite and capacity for risk within the business. So how much risk is the business willing to accept, and how much capacity for risk does the business have? And then coming up with scenarios to actually replicate what would happen, what the impact of a risk becoming a reality would be to your organization, and how much capacity does the organization have for those risks. So, you know, what are the riskiest risks that you've got? You know, looking at which risks are uncertain and risks are certain, and which risks that you need to focus on, and which risks will have the biggest impact, and how you then assess what that impact would look like in terms of your capacity. So you've got to get into a lot of detail in terms of what actually is a risk to your business, and what you can really sort of tackle. If you can't tackle a risk, if you don't have the capacity for that risk, you sometimes need to just accept that that is a risk, and you need to deal with that. But wherever possible, or you need to transfer that risk to somebody else, but wherever possible, and that's where you can use, you know, suppliers. So if you're trying to build up an IT department and you think that's too much of a risk because people won't stay up to date with all the latest technology, you need to outsource that and transfer that risk to them. That's an example of how you transfer a risk. So there's, you know, risk frameworks aren't particularly good, and risk awareness within organizations doesn't tend to be joined up. So what you tend to get is the board of directors will sit at the top level with their corporate risks, which they sort of sit there cogitating over at a board meeting, but they're not really basing that on the reality of where the risks actually are. So what you've got to do is you've got to put in place a standardized risk framework, which allows risks to be captured in all parts of the business in a standard way, which can then be correlated together and surfaced up to the managers and the board. So corporate and operational risks can be managed properly. And that gives you kind of the insight. And then this kind of strategic insight dashboard, I've just pulled together a dummy dashboard here, just as illustration purposes. But all of the things I've talked about in terms of resiliency, in terms about your KPIs, and in terms of your risk, you should pull all that together into a sort of, what a pane of, this is what I call the kind of single pane of glass on the organization. This is giving you the insight you need to actually understand what risks the business is carrying, how that's having an impact on strategic objectives, and how that's having an impact on financial outcomes. Have that all in one place if possible, or have a series of reports that provides you with all that information to give you that kind of insight. And with that insight in mind, you can then start to pull those agility levers. So going back to the model that I talked about, you can start to move the levers of your organization about. And if you've got those fundamentals that I talked about before and have that kind of flexibility built into those fundamentals, what you can do is you can move people around your organization to focus on either innovation or on the customer side of things, or you can build up more capability if you need to, and build up more skills based on what your markets are telling you. So think of it as a sort of a bed sheet that you could kind of pull around, onto those kind of four things. And sometimes the bed sheet needs to be completely spread out. Sometimes it needs to be pulled over to one particular sort of way. So, if your markets are changing and you have disruptors coming into your marketplace, who are using technology in a completely different way and are taking market share, like some of the challenger banks are now actually, things like Starling Bank. I've joined Starling Bank because they offer me a much easier way of doing banking. It's all online. It's very easy to join. I'm not bogged down by the bureaucracy of the old banks because the banking sector is now being deregulated. So the banking sectors, the traditional banks are now, pulling themselves over to this kind of model to say, we need to innovate and we need to keep up with these disruptors in our marketplace. So what we need to do is we need to put a lot of resource over onto the sort of R&D side of things, and we need to be innovating on existing solutions and new solutions as well. And again, you can pull it around a bit. So this is just another example of where you might pull it around. I put this up to try and sort of say, well, probably all of us at the moment are doing this with our businesses. So the sheet is spread sort of right across customers, capability, innovation, because we're thinking, okay, how do we change our markets are changing and the way we're doing business is changing. Our capability is changing because people are working from home. We're having to furlough people. Some people having to let people go. And we need to start innovating heavily on new service offerings. And the one in the middle, the red bit in the middle, just kind of shows that actually that innovation piece is probably the sort of is probably the bit that's getting an extra bit of focus as well. So the bed sheet's spread across all of it, but there's a little bit of extra focus going on, trying to move people's focus to innovating and maintaining customer relationships. So you get the kind of gist of how the model works, and I suppose all this. Those fundamentals that I talked about before allow you to actually have that flexibility to move your strategy in the direction of travel that you needed to go in. And if you've got all of that insight that I talked about, it gives you the view of how you need to pull your business. But we're all very frantically trying to sort of go into this configuration at the moment. And then we need to change direction again when we come out of this, because we may go back to normal, and we may touch wood, sales might start increasing again, and growth might start happening again, in which case we need to start building up capability and making sure those services are being delivered effectively. So just a couple of case studies to end with. Based on this model, I just wanted to talk about Apple, everybody's favorite company, or not. The story of Apple is an interesting one, and I just wanted to talk about Steve Jobs really coming in the second period, really, in terms of how he built. Very quickly changed. He very quickly moved from one strategy to another to actually make Apple the success they are. And when you saw them on that sort of brand equity graph before, you saw them move up quite quickly. Just a bit of background, they in the 1980s they had the biggest market share. They had a really superior product. It was classic Apple design. It was an encapsulated device with both hardware and software built into it. And the Apple II and then the Macintosh drove the company revenues really, and innovation at the company was really high. So they were a very successful company in the sort of 80s and had a far superior product. They invented things like the mouse and Windows-based system, although actually Xerox were the ones who really came up with the concept of Windows. But Apple really took that idea and made it a reality. And then Microsoft sort of fast followed later on. And then, so their strategy at the time was this really, you know, it was high innovation, focused on customer needs, and very flexible kind of resources. Like I said before, they were a product leader, so they were outsourcing a lot of their sort of manufacture of products, and very much focused on the innovation side of things. External factors though started to play a real part, and IBM and Microsoft quickly caught up. But the big trick here was that IBM and Microsoft, IBM developed hardware separately that could be upgraded, and Microsoft developed software that could run on that hardware. So you had a much more flexible machine that could be produced more cheaply as well. Apple's device was encapsulated, so you couldn't upgrade it, and it was dependent upon Apple doing all of it. With Microsoft and IBM kind of teaming up in partnership, they've come up with a much more efficient way of delivering what's now the PC, and the PC's dominated actually ever since, really, because of that flexibility that the device has. So, and also there was some internal factors at play as well. Steve Jobs was a bit of a perfectionist, and actually he was a bit of a not a very nice person to not a very nice person to work with. He had very oppressive behaviour by all accounts, and it was quite hard to work with. So there was quite a few tensions within the business, and he was ultimately fired in 1985. And then after he left, the company kind of went into this mode because they lost the kind of innovation, they lost the way a bit. And what they did is they just started to develop loads and loads of different solutions. They were trying to keep up with Microsoft and IBM and trying to compete. They ended up going from being the innovators to the kind of fast followers. And they just churned out loads of different products and went into high capabilities in terms of just getting as much out there as they could. And you know, innovation on a sort of mediocre scale, you know, products that didn't really meet the customer needs, you know, and they lost the way. I mean, they completely lost the way, and the business nearly went under. Steve Jobs returned initially as an advisor, and then very quickly moved to take over the company and became the CEO again. I'm not quite sure how he managed to do that, but yeah, that's what happened. And what he realized was the reason why the business was failing was because all they were doing was churning out mediocre products that weren't meeting customer needs, and they had too many of them. So what he did is very quickly he established this phase for 3 years. He moved the business very quickly into a stabilized phase, and he reduced the product range to just 4 products: a laptop and a desktop for the business market, and a laptop and a desktop for the consumer market. And that's all they did. They stopped the innovation. They consolidated down onto 4 products, and they then started to compete on those products. And what he managed to do is, they produced the iMac. Remember these? I don't know if people in the room are old enough to remember these, but I remember I was working at Sage at the time, and we bought one. I was in the IT department then. We bought one just because we liked the look of it, and it just sat in the corner of the IT department and was never switched on, but it looked great. In 1997, they recorded a loss of $1 billion. A year later, because of the release of the iMac, they recorded a profit of £309 million. It was quite a turnaround, really, but it was because they just consolidated down on that core product set and competed on that. And once they started to build that cash and build that money, what Steve Jobs did is then completely changed the business to be more innovative. So they moved from, once they'd established a steady revenue stream and had money coming through, they could then start putting that money towards innovation, and towards really trying to tackle the markets and become the disruptor in the markets. And that's what he did. I mean, it's well known that a lot of the senior management team in Apple were engineers, you know, from their background. You know, they came through the ranks, and so the whole business was geared towards that kind of innovation thinking, you know, the thing that Nokia didn't have. You know, the real trick was to develop the iPod first of all, and they did that because they realized that there was an emerging market for digital music. But then Steve Jobs very quickly realized that phone providers were catching up with the iPod and starting to implement basic media devices into their phones, which they were. I mean, I remember having I had a Samsung phone, I think, which had a media. I could store up to 16 songs on it, I think, at the time, and that was revolutionary. You know, you could have songs on your phone. And then so he developed the first iPhone, and you know, the concept of apps. And even when the first iPhone came out, we were all thinking, what's the point of these apps? You know, but I don't get it, you know. But I mean, how lost would we be now without our apps and our iPhones? And then evolved that even further onto the iPad, and that's really where they took off through that innovation. So I was just trying to use that as an example of how he changed the strategy, went to one strategy to stabilize and get cash in, and then very quickly move that into a different configuration. You could argue that Apple have kind of lost their way a little bit in terms of anything new. I mean, the iPhones are still great tools, and I've got an iPhone and I use it every day, many times a day. It's a fantastic bit of kit. But they're not really innovating anything new at the moment, and you could argue that all they're doing is churning out iPhones and iterations of what they've got currently. So they may lose their way again, but we'll see how that all pans out. The final example, just a couple of minutes left, and then we'll have some time for some questions. The final example is a company I worked with, actually. I worked with this company for well over 10 years, and doing various different projects with. They were called St. Ives Group, and they're now rebranded as Kin & Carter. St. Ives Group were a print and design company, and they offered turnkey printing solutions for business. So you could kind of, if you ran a business and you wanted some signage up, you could use a template that they provided with you. We helped them develop some software which allowed you to sort of build this template, and you could order your sort of stationery and your signage for your business. So they had customers like Sainsbury's and people like that. So all the signage in Sainsbury's was printed by them. They used to do book printing. They used to print the Harry Potter books. Actually, it was quite interesting when you went into the factory that printed the Harry Potter books, because you had to leave your iPhone in a locker because the latest Harry Potter book was being printed in the factory, and they didn't want anybody to know what the story was. And so it was very much in that market. Their model was very much this. It was fairly turnkey solutions, high capability in terms of churning out that kind of efficiency processes, repeatable, standardized processes. And very low innovation. Once you bought a printing machine, you could do printing with it, basically. But printed media was but what they realized is, and the chief exec at the time, I have to say, was a very sort of forward-thinking person, And I remember having the conversation 10 years ago when they said what they were going to do, and they've achieved that now. It took them 10 years to do it, but they've achieved it. But printed media was diminishing, the markets were changing, it was a race to the bottom on price, and printing machines were very expensive to buy. I mean, there were millions of pounds, some of these printing machines they had, and they were expensive to run. And because it was very commodity-based business, it was low margin. So they decided to start building up additional capability around through acquisitions and mergers, so the partnership side of things. So what they'd started to do is they started to acquire companies that offered services initially around the printing services that they provided. So you can not only get your brand and printed by St. Ives, you could get the design done by St. Ives as well, for example. So that's servitization of that product. And they started to do that initially. And then what they did is they started to then sold off bits of the print business. In fact, they sold all the print business off eventually. Once they built up that capability, so they started buying design agencies. They started to sell off the print side of things. Once they built up that revenue stream, they changed their strategy, and they started to use that new capability that they had to innovate and to develop new products and become much more customer intimate. So they moved from being churning out print in a turnkey solution to become a customer intimate company who provided innovative solutions. Completely different, and now that they've rebranded themselves, and you go on the website, Kin & Carter, they're now a digital transformation consultancy. That's all they offer. They don't do any print anymore. They've completely changed into a professional services company. It's really an interesting journey they've been on, and I was lucky enough to sort of work with them throughout that whole transition that they went through. So it was just an example, slightly more so over a longer period of time, but they constantly were changing their strategy to try and reposition themselves in their market and turn into the company that they are now. And I have to say, they had the vision to do that 10 years ago. They only rebranded last year to Kin & Carter, but they've completely changed. They're just metamorphosed into something completely different. So that's it from me. I hope you found that interesting and didn't get sick of my dulcet tones. The conclusion of this is kind of strategy is unique to you. Strategy is about focusing. Actually, I talked about that before. The tools used in the traditional approach are still relevant. And this is about building an agile environment to be able to respond. It's not about it's not about changing the tools that you've used previously. This is about building something differently, something different. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Mark now. I think, Mark, you've got, unless there's any questions, is there? Has anybody any questions? No.
Alistair, it's Mark here. Can
Hi.
you hear me okay? Hi, Alistair. I just had one question. So I was listening as I was going through, was just in terms of as we start to come out of the current the current situation, which do you think are going to be the most important elements for most businesses in the model that you presented to us?
Well, I think as I said, I think if I go back to the model there, I think it's going to be interesting actually, because we just don't know, and this is the whole point of having this kind of approach. We don't know exactly how well the economy is going to bounce back, do we? So if everybody's been put into hibernation and then things continue on as was, then you might be able to start just ramping up as you were, but if we find that the economy starts to go into recession and budgets become tight and money isn't flowing around as much, then people are going to have to start innovating. So they're going to have to pull themselves over to that innovation piece and continue to innovate on their services and solutions, and actually look at the markets and do much more in terms of analysis of the markets that they're in. So it depends on, I mean, without sort of trying to sort of not answer the question, it's going to depend on how well the economy responds and how well we can bounce back from this. It's quite unpredictable, but that's the whole point of this model, really, is that it will be unpredictable, and you've just got to keep monitoring what's going on and then trying to respond accordingly. So a lot of people are furloughing staff at the moment, rightly so. The way that you might bring those staff back into the fold might depend on how the market starts to respond. So building up that capability again might be a sort of incremental thing, and not going full throttle on it, and the types of people that you retain within your organization and the types of people that you furlough would be different as well.
I totally agree. I think clearly a lot depends on, as you say, what happens, what the recovery looks like. Also, I guess what what sector you're in and where you are and what you're doing before. I guess it does give businesses an opportunity to really challenge what they're doing, and
absolutely,
and what's going to work going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Thanks.
I think we've.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think there's any more questions immediately, but if there's a function there, I think to raise any further questions. So please do, and we'll have another opportunity at the end to answer any questions.
No problem. So do you want to talk about these bits? Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think I've got. Yeah, I think I can move it. So yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. Just to say, Alistair, thanks very much for the insights you shared with us. They've been absolutely fascinating, and the model, the strategic tensions model, and managing those that you shared, I think is, particularly at this moment, is absolutely invaluable. Clearly, resilience and agility are going to be absolutely key for organisations now and in the coming period, really.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Completely appropriate. So, but very interesting as well. So, many thanks for that.
Okay, no problem.
So I'm literally just going to finish the presentation by sharing what else is available, really, to help help with Humber, with businesses in the Humber. What's available through the program. So in addition to the webinar you've heard today, we're planning a schedule of further events over the next weeks and months, which will be a mixture between events that cover areas of innovation and strategy, as we've heard today, but also we'll look at particular particular digital needs going forward at this moment. So things like, remote working, cybersecurity, and so on, moving to cloud and so on. So a bit of a balance really to try and cater for current circumstances. There's also opportunity to apply currently for ICT for Growth grants, which I'll share a bit more details in a moment. We have Digital Catalyst, which is more one-to-one support. In terms of sort of deciding remote access, whether to migrate to cloud, so assistance with that side of things, and planning and scheduling team interaction. So I'll share a bit more detail on some of these areas. Oh, actually, I can't actually change the slides. Brilliant, thanks. So in terms of the ICT for Growth grants, so these are available now, and the process to apply for them and receive grants has been sped up to help businesses quickly through this current situation. The grants are available for hardware, software, and infrastructure, and the overall project values must be between 2,500 and the very precise figure of 24,999, all excluding VAT. Often the rules around grants and what have you mean that they obviously reaches certain limits. The grant available is 40% of any total project spend. So there's the example you can see there where an overall project spend of 2,500 would be eligible for a grant of £1,000. So a decent contribution to things like setting up cloud-based access and or buying new equipment and so on. The payment's got to be made first, so grant payments are in arrears, and just invoice and proof of payment are required. And as I say, the application process has been accelerated to the point where the Kingston upon Hull City Council are looking to make payments within 2 weeks of receiving an application. Okay. Then just again, Alistair, if you wouldn't mind, move me forward one slide, please. That's brilliant. So details of the telephone number and the web link to find more information about the grant details are provided on screen. Thanks, Alistair. Okay, so we also have support available through Digital Catalyst, which is where we have a team of technical specialists that can work with you on a one-to-one basis as a business to overcome challenges, but also look for opportunities to improve your organisation through digital technology.
Mark, I think everybody's left.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you're right, actually. Yeah, it's right. It's we could carry on. I think there is. Yeah,
everybody dropped off, so I just rather than just talking to us three.
yeah. No, I think that's fair enough. Right, let's we'll call it. We'll call it a stop at that point. No, that's fine. Cool. Okay. No,
was that okay? Was that okay? Did that hit the button?
I was dead interested. I found it really. Yeah, found it really useful. I think unfortunately just the short amount of time and perhaps
there wasn't that many people on there, so it was getting chance.
No.
Yeah, exactly. So no, it's fine. I mean, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to make sure it was what you were after. That was all.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, look, I mean, I think there's a chance. Obviously, I did make a few notes and what have you on bits and bobs. So, opportunity to sort of catch up when we speak next week. Anyway, in terms of the detail. But no, enjoyed it. It was really useful. It's a really interesting model, isn't it? It's
yeah.
I think it's and very flexible as well. But just something you can almost right. I think, as you say, it's the antidote to that sort of. Sort of traditional model where you can roll it out almost any time, can't you, to challenge what you're doing and use it in a fairly agile way for changes of direction, really. So it sounded really good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the whole point of it.
Yeah, good stuff.
Okay, well,
Great.
glad you enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you next week. Yeah, have a good Easter break. If we can possibly have one under these conditions.
Indeed, yeah. We're still doing the egg hunt in the garden with the kids, so regardless, so at least we'll be doing that. But no, nice to see you. Thanks very much, and Helen, thanks very much for joining us as well. Nice to meet you too.
You too.